Alright, Debian stable, Ubuntu, Mint, all this other shit. I made a video about, like, Arch being way too new. You know what I mean? Like, packages are just way too new in order to be used on, like, a production system. Debian's got the opposite problem. So, there's, as time goes on and software updates far more often, there's a need for software to be stable, yet also somewhat up to date. Like, you don't need the bleeding edge version of every package, but you also can't have it be like 2 years out of date. That's a problem. So, because what happens is like you install Arch Linux and then you get like a bad update and then suddenly all your shit's broken, you know? But on Debian stable, yeah, it's really stable. But you also have this problem too where your software can have horrible bugs in it that aren't going to be updated for like another 2 years until like the next major version comes out. So we've got this problem where a lot of people are recommending stuff like Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Debian stable, and people are like, "Hey, I've got this bug with this application, and should I report it to the developers?" And I'm like, "No, don't report it to the developers because they're gonna ask you what version you're using, and you're using one that's like 2 years out of date, and backports doesn't give you a fix yet." So you end up with not necessarily a stable distribution because the packages you get are not stable. But what you do end up getting is you get a very stale distribution. So instead of calling it like Debian stable, you could call it Debian stale because the packages are like so old that they may not even be usable anymore. Especially as a lot of the software relies on internet services, that becomes a problem. Like where I was trying to use the Feather wallet for like Bitcoin. You know, I was using that, but I was using the flatpak. And I tried to log in, or not log in, I tried to set up my wallet with it, and it was like, oh, actually, you can't do that because your flatpak version's out of date. So I was like, what the fuck? So I had to use the app image because that was the only way to get an up to date package, you know? And part of this is on for Flatpak, that is mostly on the developers for not updating their software. So luckily, if you are using a stable distribution but you use Flatpak for everything, you end up with a much more stable distribution because you're less prone to bugs. So if you're using something like Ubuntu, I would actually recommend using the snap package for everything. If you're using Debian, you know, set up Flatpak, and a lot of people that use these distributions, they want the repositories because they don't want Flatpak. But when you do that, you end up with much less stable, uh, programs because one, they don't run in a container, so you end up with like system utilities that need to be updated every so often. But the native packages also can potentially have bugs if they're not updated in a reasonable amount of time, which happens on these stable distributions. So, what do I recommend then if you're like a new user, you're getting into Linux and you want like the cool Linux experience but without the you want up-to-date packages but you also want stability. And I think the answer I got to go with these days is probably like Fedora. Maybe OpenSUSE once Slow Roll comes out, maybe because I really don't like how they do their vendors. Fedora's vendors are a lot better, where they use RPM Fusion for everything. So, like with Fedora, you get reasonably up to date packages. It'll support your hardware, assuming you have newer hardware, but it'll also support older hardware. And you get the stability, but you also get newer packages, which is, again, important as we get into this world where things need to be updated every so often, where software is not perfect, you know. And that was where I always thought Arch really fucked up, was it used to be cool in like 2016, but since open source development has exploded since then and you're running a lot more software that updates so often, Arch gets updates way too often, and because of that a lot of stuff just breaks because you know you can't test everything as it comes out. That's just, it's unreasonable to expect that. So we need like this middle ground. We need this middle ground between stable and like ultra stable distributions that are only really suitable for servers, and rolling release distributions or like slow roll distributions like Manjaro, where things need to be They may need a bit over 2 weeks worth of testing to get everything ironed out. So it's surprising how few distributions actually take that approach. Like I've even noticed that Gentoo has a few e-builds that are like way behind the current version. And that's kind of annoying to see because like if I'm using something like Audacious, right, it has a Scrobbler plugin. So if you want to like scrobble your plays to Last.fm or something, you can do that. But it's broken on the current build on Gentoo because you're using an outdated version. Unless you use the flatpak, but if you use the flatpak, I don't know how to theme it. So I'll be stuck on whatever the default Kvantum theme is because I don't know how to do it. I'm gonna figure all that stuff out eventually because Flatpak I do think is kind of the future of package management because you have so many programs that aren't system utilities that don't need to be updated along with the rest of the system and can be run in the sandbox. And it's why people are starting to say that immutable distributions may be the future, even though they may tear up your drive. They have that stability, they have the rock solid stability, and they also have more up to date packages because you're always on the flatpak or you're always on brew or whatever, and packages update independently of the distribution, which is important. So you get much more stable packages, and if they aren't stable, you're in a container, so it doesn't really matter, you know. And I think that's, I mean, I've been using Bazite for the past like month or two now. It's been great. I actually really like it. It doesn't like notify you when there's an update or anything, so every week or so I'll run an update. But it works really well, and I'm able to use Brew, Flatpak, RPM, OS tree when I need like a printer driver or something. And I've got DistroBox for DaVinci Resolve, which I haven't tried yet. I need to try to render something in there. But yeah, I mean, we are reaching the point where containers are becoming a better option than the native packages. And I think that's just a good idea. I think that's a really cool thing. I'm sure there's always going to be a need for native packages, but as containers become more prominent and as more packages start to, because like that's become a new selling point for me is like if a package has a flat pack, that's really good for me because then I'm able to use it on an immutable distribution. Like I said, the only package I've got that isn't a flat pack is a or like burr or whatever is my printer driver, and that's because it's obviously something that needs to be built into the system or uses the system's file system. So it's obviously more secure. I mean, like, there's a lot of things you can do within the home directory. You don't even have to break the sandbox in order to install malware because the home directory can be read anyways, and it can be written too. But you do also have a much more stable experience when you're on an immutable distribution. At least I think. I'm sure Mint is fine. I'm sure Ubuntu is fine. But these stable distributions, yeah, you got to run outdated packages in order to do it. So, what's the middle ground here? What are we doing? And I think I'm starting to agree with people. I do think that immutable distributions are kind of the way to go. So, I don't know. It's when they were first coming out, like Fedora Atomic, I was kind of worried about like launching applications and getting stuff sim linked and whatever to my desktop. Because like when it first started, when if you installed Discord by Flatpak, you'd have to launch it through like the terminal using the Flatpak way of launching things, which is horrible. I hate having to launch Flatpaks through the terminal. But now they show up in the menu as they're supposed to, which is it is game changer for this. You know, and it really does. Sandboxing really does help with all this weird stuff that happens in Linux. I think it'll help with stability. I think it'll help with security. So that's my opinion. What I recommend. Maybe I wouldn't recommend an immutable distribution to a brand new user yet because there are obviously you're going to run into a point where you need something installed natively just because there's so many things like VPNs and stuff, and OpenVPN isn't always the best option. So, we'll see what happens. But Yeah, it gets me thinking because like when you to get back to Debian is like if somebody has a bug on Debian, they're like, "Oh, I gotta report this to developers," and I'm like, "No, no, no, don't report this to the developers because you're using the package that's like 2 years out of date." You know, I think I already mentioned this, but I wanted to repeat that again. It's like you've got Linux Mint being recommended to people even though they've got so many features that are and like stuff that comes on modern Linux that's like outright missing. And forgive me, I'm gonna have I'm gonna have trouble thinking of them off the top of my head because this is all kind of off the cuff. But yeah, you have these distributions that are so old now that like, can you recommend them to a new user? And I'm having trouble with that. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.